Okay, so on behalf of Shelby and Angela, thank you for attending our presentation today. Next slide, we have an overview of what we're going to cover. And so let's go to the next one. So why resilience and why now? So the first iteration of this study was presented in CASE 2011, and then it was further refined for the SIG-US Alfreda Chapman Award, but then it got shelved as I moved on to other work. And so I've chosen to revisit resilience as my capstone research project of my academic career as I am transitioning to phased retirement. So I'm very pleased that my favorite conference is my last. So Angela's research on remote, rural, asset-based community development and my work with the information environment of people experiencing homelessness led us both to this idea of how information behaviors play a role in resiliency. So this collaboration has resulted in an article of about 7,000 words, excluding references. So what you got for CASE was a 1,500 word paper and a 20-minute presentation. So this is pretty much the equivalent of a 2-minute movie trailer for a 2-hour feature film. So we're going to divide the paper into 2 parts. Part 1 maps human information behavior onto resilience concepts, while part 2 addresses the application of this mapping to our research and to research in LIS in general. So why now? Well, we want to be really clear that we were just not opportunistic people who took advantage of a global pandemic to jump on the resilience hot topic train. So Shelby and I started this in the end of 2018, early 2019. We've been working on it, refining it, various iterations. So we appreciate that this is the session on contemplation and resilience, because this project sort of fits into both. It was kind of unfortunate that a global pandemic occurred while we were working on this, but it is a real opportunity to help us tag on all of these concepts, the process, information resilience, to an event that almost everybody experienced in one way or another. And so it's something that will be relatable to lay people as well as academics. Next slide, please. So we're going to have just a little bit of context here. Let's establish some grounding for a general understanding of resilience. So we were all in the same COVID storm, but we weren't in the same boats. And this is how the resilience process is experienced. It's not a binary state where one is resilient or not. It's something that can be a daily process that many people live. And resilience is something that we often apply to individuals, but it can apply to groups, family, friend networks, organizations like libraries, and even communities. So we can examine posts on social media, for example, to see how misinformation, disinformation affects vaccination efforts for COVID. Both groups, or all the groups with different takes on this, feel that they are resilient and doing the resilient thing by either getting a vaccination or not. And often that depends on the information that they have found seeking purposefully or serendipitously on social media, for example. On the right, we have a pile of rubber bands. This is the metaphor that is used frequently. The rubber band gets stretched. That is the trauma, the crisis, but then it goes back to where it was in the start, but it never goes all the way back. So the frequency of trauma, the frequency of how this rubber band gets stretched means that there's residual damage. Listening to Dr. Patton's powerful keynote on epistemicide, I practiced that in academia, and the story she shared of the experiences of BIPOC faculty it was clear that resilience is applicable to these stories, the frequency of which the BIPOC faculty experience trauma, crises, means that there's residual damage and it can aggregate to the point where they leave the academy. So that's a quick introduction. Shelby's going to give the strategy on the lit review, and then Angela's going to give a quick overview of the main points of the paper. So thank you. You need to.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. The research gathered for this paper involved Dr. Hershberger incorporating the references collected from her 2011 paper on information resilience. Through the pro-growing process, common themes in the research were discovered by following leads, making inquiries, and receiving feedback from our reviewers. Also, information from serendipitous encounters with colleagues and popular media contributed to the literature review. This process continued until the data became redundant. The resources covered various subjects beyond the library and information science field, such as psychology, sociology, and ecology. Some major themes found include stability versus flexibility in ecology, resilience research as descriptive, normative, and hybrid approaches, along with resilience as a photogenic paradigm, and Angela will elaborate.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so I can see the translation at the bottom, so I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me. We discovered 3 ways of thinking about resilience early on in the literature review. These are sort of overarching paradigms. One is the ecological model, and this is where examination into resilience began. And the basic options there, the paradigms, was stability versus flexibility. And so ecologists were looking at ecosystems, and originally they predicted that the ones that were most stable through trauma were the ones that were most resilient. And eventually that also opened up to say, okay, it's maybe not the ones that are stable, but the ones that can withstand the biggest change and still go back to the previous state. So the flexible ones are the most resilient. So if we think about this in terms of that elastic metaphor, that the elastic is the flexibility model. We also discovered that there are a number of different conceptualizations of resilience. And so there's descriptive approaches to looking at it. And these are, of course, very technical, mathematical variables. You're looking at testing things, that sort of thing. And then there are more normative approaches that look at it, at resilience as something that is much less definable. And then there are some approaches that use both to it as well. And we also discovered that early in the adoption of the word resilience in the literature, much of the research was coming from a pathogenic approach, so examining resilience in the face of something that was wrong. So looking at, a trauma or something that negative that happened that required resilience. And over time, as positive psychology came into play, it was introduced that it can also be studied from a photogenic approach, so a more positive approach. The resilience process has basically 4 stages. There's the baseline, which is the more or less stable state of normal that exists before the triggering stressor. There is some sort of obvious or measurable triggering stressor. It can be a chronic or acute crisis or some sort of traumatic event. We can think about this in terms of, a psychological event. It could be, an environmental, a weather catastrophe. It can be absolutely any kind of triggering stressor that relates to the environment that you're looking at. There's some sort of response, either by the individual or the system, that leads to changes or adaptation or recovery of some sort, and that is the outcome. And the outcome is the state after the changes have been absorbed. So individual characteristics, thinking back to Julia's first metaphor, I think of this in terms of how big is your boat. The bigger your boat is, the more resilient you're likely going to be. And so the characteristics that we discovered in the literature fell into basically 3 different categories. There were personal characteristics. So these are things that are inherent to the individual. they may be circumstances that the individual hasn't got any control over. So for example, babies who had good temperaments or didn't suffer from colic were found later in life to be described as more resilient people. And so you really have little control over that. The personal is wrapped around with family support. And so situations or individuals who have a great deal of family support are more likely to be seen as resilient. And then all of that is wrapped in the community and institutional support. And if we think about this in terms of how libraries come into play, the library would be a community institution that can support resilience in individuals. We identified a number, I've got to think about 9 here listed, psychological factors that influence a person's resilience. So things like cognitive flexibility, or the ability to adapt beliefs about the self, the world, and the future. Elasticity and plasticity came into play. This is the ability of a person to reorganize neural pathways based on new experiences. This is very much, the plasticity part of it is very much a neurobiological system at play there, but it's being discussed more frequently in the resilience literature as well. Hardiness, which is curiosity or proactive beliefs about an overall optimism about the future. Locus of control is how much confidence the individual has that they can build their own positive future or destiny. Coherence is the enduring feeling of confidence that the environment is predictable. And self-efficacy is the confidence in one's own ability to manage unexpected situations. And so these are all sort of phrased in the positive. So people who are more cognitively flexible or who have a stronger sense of locus of control are going to fall on the more resilient end of the spectrum. Additionally, we've got other factors here like self-regulation, which is the ability to generalize and decide if, whether, or how to respond to changes. Spirituality, the belief that life extends beyond physical parameters. Cognitive biases, so the ability to preserve your self-esteem or subjective happiness despite facts to the contrary. And meaning making, which is ascription of value to lived experiences. And so what we were looking for when we were identifying these characteristics were characteristics that we've seen echoed in the library research to some degree. We also encountered a number of criticisms of resilience. There's no way to talk about resilience and also ignore the power dynamics at play. So when we're talking about resilient people, for example, we're talking about outliers, people who've outperformed expectations, which necessarily means that the expectations were low to begin with. And when we think about, groups of people who we have low expectations of, that as a society, I'm generalizing here, but we come up with the groups who are disadvantaged. So the homeless, the people who live remotely and rurally, people who are poor, and don't sort of fit outside the parameters of what we would consider average. And so by examining people who are in that disadvantaged position, we're forcing our perceptions of what resilient means on them. There's also issues of privilege that come in with those power dynamics. So who gets to define what is resilient and what's not resilient? There are personal and political agendas. So defining something as resilient has unequal benefits and costs, and the costs are typically borne by the people who have less power in this dynamic. And then probably the biggest criticism of resilience is that when we celebrate resilience, or when we focus on how resilient people are, how they've outperformed expectations, it takes the expectation away that we need to make changes that make the need for resilience redundant in the first place. So we have systems that are set up that are failing people. And then when we say, look, you didn't fail, then we don't have to change the system to stop people from failing in the first place. So this brings me to useful metaphor number 3 in our presentation. And I bet you that picture is going to take a while. Resilience is about how much water we have in a reservoir or a well that we can draw on during a drought. So all of these characteristics, that psychological characteristics that I shared with you in the previous slides, basically are the equivalent of water in a well. And if you have more of these, then when times get tough, then the water goes up and down, but the well never goes dry. And so the people who are most resilient are always able to keep a little bit of water in the well that they can pull from whenever something traumatic happens. So what does this have to do with information resilience? With information resilience. Well, one thing that we've discovered is that the information resilience process relates fairly closely to the resilience process that I shared with you before. So I've used the same headings here. Baseline is the more or less stable state of normal information seeking that occurs, of course, ranging on a spectrum there from none to a lot, perhaps is one way to describe it. There is a triggering stressor, so chronic or acute crisis or traumatic event that triggers an anomalous state of knowledge. And some people will go out and seek information in response to that, and some will not. The response is the information seeking behaviors a person engages to return to that baseline state. And then the outcome is the state of knowledge, skill, or emotion or affect toward information after the changes have been absorbed. There are a number of connections to information behavior beyond those, and I've got a few listed here. We're not going to go into a great amount of detail on any of these because that is actually going to be part 2 of our paper. We've submitted the first part of this to CGILS for publication, hopefully, and we're working on a second part that's going to elaborate on the information behavior connections. But there are connections to theories. So for example, in response to a traumatic event where someone recognizes a need for information, the various responses could be monitoring or blunting. We're talking here about uncertainty that leads to information seeking. And finding information can lead to information overload, as well as various other affective responses to these information needs. There are also connections to information behaviors, populations. So for example, resilience is often studied in at-risk groups like the homeless or refugees, for example. And I think that is still fertile ground for investigation of resilience, although we do need to take into consideration the power dynamics. And then of course, policy implications, which relates to the final criticism there of resilience theories. We need to, when we identify a case of resilience or a resilient person or a resilient system, the onus is on us to examine the policy implications that created that need for resilience in the first place, to make sure that our policies are not causing disadvantage where it doesn't exist or where it shouldn't exist. So what's next for us? Watch CGILS for part 1 of our findings. Fingers crossed. Of course, we just submitted, so we haven't got the acceptance for that, but we're hoping it will be published there. We're writing part 2 now, and we're going to map out specific intersection points between information behavior theories and resilience, and we're hoping to publish that in CGILS as well. And that's it. So we can open it up for questions.